the United Kingdom, debates in particular about basic income and the future of the world of work. Is technology and automation changing the world of work to the degree that something like a basic income will become necessary, because people won't be able to earn what they used to be able to from work if they're replaced by automation, or that they may wish to balance work and forms of leisure and other forms of activity in new kinds of ways, and the basic income may be necessary to facilitate that. And of course, we've had in the pandemic, in the COVID crisis, a very big shock to our economies and our labor markets, and that's meant a lot of people becoming very financially vulnerable, and many people are arguing now that we need to think about something like a basic income as a mechanism for ensuring a resilience and financial well-being for the entirety of a population in the context of shocks of the kind we've experienced around the world in the last few months. So that's some of the kind of background to what we'll be talking about today. And we've got some really good panelists to speak to you about these issues. We're going to have an introduction from each of those in a minute, and we're going to open up to a discussion, and then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A for people to discuss and debate these things online with us. The first of our presenters is Daniel Susskind, and Daniel is a fellow at the University of Oxford, Balliol College. He's an author of a book called A World Without Work, in which he proposed a conditional basic income. Some people talk about participation incomes, and we can ask Daniel about that in due course. He's done a lot of work on the future of professions, the future of artificial intelligence, what it's doing to the world of work and labour, and it's great to have him here. He's also been an advisor in the UK government, where he's worked in the strategy unit in the Cabinet Office, advising ministers, so has really good experience of how policy is made and shaped and formed, and bring that contribution to this discussion too. And then after Daniel's spoken, we've got Anna Thomas, and Anna is the co-founder and director of the Institute for the Future of Work. The Institute grew out of a commission on the future of work, which she established, and which had leading figures from the world of work, from business, from trade unions, from academia, looking at how we can shape and thrive in a future of great automation, the so-called fourth industrial revolution. And her team's research has highlighted the links between automation and voting patterns in the UK, exposure to automation and what it does for people's political preferences. And there are a number of issues there that relate these debates to questions of political economy, of how we think about different political constituencies and how they might mobilize behind some version of basic income, or may indeed be opposed to it. If they have interest in the existing welfare state, they may be opposed to something like a basic income. So we can talk about that in due course too with Anna. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the discussion. We're recording this evening's event, so it will be made available after it's gone out live on the Basic Income Conversations YouTube channel. Everyone is on mute this evening except for the speakers, and there will be a chance for people to ask questions, which we'll talk about a bit later. And you can submit your Q&A on the Zoom chat function. And just to say that this is the first of the events that the Basic Income Conversation is doing this summer, but there will be more. So it's important, I'll say a little bit at the end, there'll be a bit more for people to connect to and to think about as we go forward. But that's probably enough of introduction from me. Let me ask Daniel to give us some remarks to get the conversation going. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much. A great pleasure to be with everyone this evening, and thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I'm interested in my work in universal basic income for two reasons. The first is as a possible response to the threat of automation, and the second, the more recent interest, is as a possible response to the pandemic that we currently find ourselves in. And I thought what I'd do in these first few minutes is just set out my thinking before this pandemic began on the universal basic income in the context of automation, and then later on we could talk as well perhaps about the role of a UBI in the context of this pandemic. I mean, so first let me talk about automation. I mean, every day we hear stories of systems and machines taking on tasks we thought only human beings alone could ever do, making medical diagnoses and driving cars, drafting legal documents and designing beautiful buildings, composing music and writing news reports. You know, what does all of this mean for the vast majority of us for whom our job is our main, if not our only, source of income? I wrote A World Without Work, a book that was published in January of this year, so before the pandemic began, because I didn't think we were taking seriously enough the threat of a world where there's not enough well-paid work for everyone to do because of the advances in technological progress that are taking place at the moment. Now, it's worth being clear that I don't think there's going to be some technological big bang in the next few years, after which we'll all wake up and find out that, you know, we're out of a job. The robots have taken all the jobs. People who pick up the book expecting that sort of story are going to be disappointed. I don't think that's going to happen. But what I do worry about, and my preoccupation in the book, is that as we move through the 21st century, because of this technological progress, that more and more people might find they're unable to make the sorts of economic contributions to society that they might have hoped or expected to make in the 20th century. And this, it seems to me, is, you know, a fundamental challenge to the way that we live together in society today. And it's the challenge that preoccupies me in the book, and that I'm thinking through how we might respond to it. In the book, what I do is I set out two different types of technological unemployment, two different ways that people might find themselves without work because of technological progress. And this is useful just for framing the way in which I think about universal basic income in the context of automation. The first type of technological unemployment is what I call frictional technological unemployment. And here, there's plenty of work to be done. The challenge is that for various reasons, people aren't able to take up that work. And I think the most familiar reason for frictional technological unemployment is the skills mismatch, that people might not have the skills and capabilities required to do whatever new jobs have to be done. There's then also, I think, another mismatch, which is the place mismatch, that people might simply not live in the same place that jobs are being created. And it's worth remembering, you know, the era, there was a time when people thought that those sorts of worries about place would no longer matter. People spoke about the death of distance and how the world is flat. But actually, in looking for work today, where you live matters more than ever. And alongside this skills mismatch and this place mismatch, I write about the identity mismatch as well, where people have a particular conception of themselves and they're willing to stay unemployed in order to protect that identity. So think of adult men in the US displaced from manufacturing roles by new technologies. Some say that they would rather not work at all, and this is why they're unemployed. They'd rather not work at all than take up so-called, and it's a really unfortunate term, so-called pink collar work. But the term is designed to capture the fact that many of the roles that are out of reach of automation, many of the roles in which we see lots of job growth are predominantly done by women. So, you know, over 90% of preschool and kindergarten teachers in the United States are women. More than 80% of social workers and nurses are women. So there's one type of technological unemployment, which is this frictional type, where there is work to be done, but because of those mismatches that I described before, people aren't able to take up that work. The second type of technological unemployment, and this is a more troubling story, which is where there's simply not enough work for people to do, full stop. And I call this structural technological unemployment. And I spend a lot of time in the book trying to explain why I think, given the technological changes that are taking place, this is a realistic threat when we look out into the 21st century. Now, all of this is just by way of preface for setting out what I think about the universal basic income, which is that in the book, I approach it with a degree of, with reservations, with a degree of skepticism. And the reason is that I've traditionally seen the universal basic income as an imperfect solution to a problem we don't yet face. And let me explain what I mean by that. By problem we don't yet face, I mean that the problem now in thinking about the impact of technology on the labor market seems to me to be far more, it seems to be a frictional story rather than a structural story. It's a story about there being work for people to do. The challenge is, how do we help people to take up that work? And it's always seemed to me that a universal basic income doesn't really help us address the skills mismatch, the place mismatch, or the identity mismatch. It's a solution to a problem we don't yet face. It's a solution to structural technological unemployment where there simply isn't enough work to be done, full stop. So that's why I've thought it's not really a solution to the problem that we currently face. But I also think it's an imperfect solution, and an imperfect solution when we do find ourselves facing structural technological unemployment. And the reason I think it's imperfect is, and this is why I argue for a conditional basic income, is because I worry that the universality of a basic income would undermine the sense of social solidarity that we rely on at the moment. So let me be clear. I think a basic income solves the fundamental problem that we might face in a world with structural technological unemployment, which is, how do we share out income in society where we can't rely upon our traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do? You know, what mechanism takes its place? And in the book, I argue the state has to take its place, and that a basic income is an important part of the state's response. But I think it's, just to come back to why I think it's imperfect, this idea of universality, I worry, undermines a sense of social solidarity that we rely upon today. And this social solidarity today is fundamentally, I think, an economic one. That social solidarity comes from a sense that everybody is pulling their, collective economic weight, that people are paying into the collective economic pot through the taxes that they pay and the work that they do. And if they're not doing that, then there's an expectation that they're actively looking for work if they're able and willing to do so. What I worry about is that this universality undermines that sense of social solidarity. And the reason I think we need a conditional basic income is because we need to find a way to provide people an opportunity to make non-economic contributions to society in return for a basic income if they're unable to make the sort of traditional economic contributions that we might want them to make. And so I write at length about why I think in a world of structural technological unemployment, we'll need a conditional basic income instead, where this basic income comes with various conditions attached. Responsibility to make non-economic contributions instead of economic ones. Now that might sound relatively radical, but already today about 15 million people, for instance, volunteer regularly. The volunteering sector is worth about £50 billion, it's said, which is more valuable than the UK energy sector. The argument that I'm making is that we might recognize some of this socially very useful work that doesn't necessarily receive a wage in return, that it might represent a contribution, albeit not an economic one, that we can, as a society, as a community, recognize as being a socially valuable contribution in return for a basic income. So I will finish there. The fundamental point, really, in the context of automation, is that until now I've seen UBI again as a sort of imperfect solution to a problem we don't yet face. The pandemic that we're going through at the moment has made me rethink that view, but I'll save that for a conversation later on. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Daniel. Thanks a lot. We'll come back, as you say, to this point about whether the pandemic has accelerated various trends and exposed various issues that we need to talk about in the context of UBI. But let's now go to Anna Thomas from the Institute for the Future of Work. Anna, what about your perspectives on these questions?
Thanks very much, Nick, for that. Thank you to Compass and to Michael as well for inviting me to talk at this webinar, this important webinar. Daniel, you're a really hard act to follow, but it's an honour to try even on Zoom. I'm going to structure my thoughts in sort of three main heads. First of all, look at what we're facing, so the context in which we're having this debate. Secondly, why it is a good time to really talk about UBI and begin to get into some of the detail. And thirdly, what happens next, what should happen next, against the background of those two things. Firstly, we're at a critical moment in time, really, in terms of thinking about the future of our economy and work. So it's really important to do what you're doing now at Compass, and stop and take a bigger view of where we are and where we need to be before we look at ways to cope with old and new challenges that have come to the fore recently. So if we start to look at what we're facing, and building a little bit on what Daniel has said, COVID has hit us in the middle of what really is a sort of massive technological revolution, which we described as a structural transformation of the economy, highlighting the fact that the positive and adverse impacts of that transformation are not evenly spread across demographic groups, across skills groups, types of work, sector, or as Daniel says, regionally, right across the economy. And that's important background. So overall, we've begun to see what we think is an acceleration of many trends in work and in the labour market, including in some types and uses of technology, although research is at a really, really early stage at the moment. And when I say that, I mean automation, but not just automation. And automation, not just in the sense of labour displacement in a traditional sense, but also in the sense of using technology for a variety of uses, including organising and managing work, which is becoming increasingly important. So on top of that, the pandemic has introduced new demands and targets and restrictions. So the accelerations that we're seeing isn't entirely straightforward. And its effects, the effects of the pandemic, they aren't evenly spread either. So we've seen different types of inequality in both work and health, exposed, as I mentioned, but also compound together as people often most likely to be exposed to the virus in the front line and people-facing roles often are frequently those in less secure or protected work or on poor terms, for example, without proper sick pay. And we've seen often it's those people who are most exposed in different ways that have slipped through the cracks of government support. And that's not to say we haven't supported it, we have strongly supported it. But what we have seen in our interviews of self-employed and atypical workers, really high levels of angst from people that would be in similar financial situations even, but they work on different employment contracts with different entitlements or sometimes none. And we've seen things like about 57% of workers not entitled to government support have experienced a reduction of pay. 49% of those anticipate problems paying really basic bills. And many of these belong to the group of 3.7 million precarious workers in the UK. The UK does have particularly high levels of precarious work compared to comparator countries in the European Union and elsewhere. And many of those include key workers, including workers in food production, health and social care, logistics and casual delivery work, who've plainly taken, and they've had to take, a sort of undue proportion of risk and adverse consequences through the pandemic. So taking all that together, it does mean we need a sort of an immediate and emergency response, and also a longer term, more strategic response. And these don't necessarily need to be separate. Perhaps the first can inform the second. I'm being a bit slow, that was just under my first head. So why is it a good time to talk about UBI and ensure it's part of a mainstream conversation moving forward about how we tackle huge challenges that we face, especially how we see and how we contend with inequalities in work and health? I really think the Overton window has shifted for 3 reasons. And in identifying those, I'm borrowing from the Future of Work Commission session and report, although these views are my own. I can't blame Daniel or anybody else. Daniel was on the commission. Thank you very much for that, Daniel. So first, from a sort of philosophical point of view, it's clear that the idea of individual responsibility has died a death in the pandemic. It isn't, I don't think, morally or politically acceptable to suggest that a key care worker on a temporary contract who doesn't quite qualify for either job support schemes is somehow responsible for his or her exposure to COVID or the secondary consequences of that. Secondly, the roles of local and national government. There is, as we all know here, significantly more work to be done, and we know that too many have not been protected. However, it is right that the Chancellor has shown leadership and fresh thinking in his adoption of the 80% Nordic income protection supported model, and there have been some calls from within government for boosted levels of fiscal and even decision-making powers of local government in order to enable bold, innovative local responses that meet local needs. That would be necessary in order to progress a UBI pilot. Thirdly, the harder economic perspective. There are two bits, I guess, to the argument here. Andy Haldane has recently made the point that's obviously the obvious point, but also really necessary, that it's really clear now that the income people have earned is not linked to the social or economic value of the work that they do. And in addition to that, the main argument against, I suppose, UBI, that it may act as a disincentive to work, has fallen away. The issue we are now facing, and I'm building on what Daniel has said here, is that the growth sectors, the sectors that were creating jobs at the highest rates, so sectors like leisure, hospitality, personal service, and different forms of caring work have now stalled. So we certainly won't be seeing a transition of displaced workers into these sectors for a while yet. Not that that means anything like mass technological employment. I should add here that there is a lack of research about disincentives, but the Finnish pilot perhaps got closest to that. It was focused on unemployed people only, and only offered people the amount that was equal to their welfare benefit. So its use as a pilot is limited, or caveated rather, but it also did tend to suggest that UBI wasn't a disincentive to work. I noticed there was a question on the chat, a really good question, about whether or not it could support the unpaid caring work of women. And so I'll add that as an argument. I think it's right that one of the things we need to do is revalue caring work. And one way to do that is to reward unpaid caring work. And so there is an argument, I think, that a UBI would in some sense reward unpaid caring work, and that's important not only in itself, but because of the importance economically and for a bunch of other reasons why we need to value caring work more now. So where next? I'll whip through this bit. UBI isn't one policy. I think it's better seen as a family of policies with common traits. And without further research and consultation and costing, it's too early to come down on a particular model of basic income. But we do really strongly think that it needs to become part of a mainstream conversation as we think about ways to update the system of social support for the 21st century post-pandemic, where plainly the current system can't cope with the new demands, and we need generally a reorientation of the system to support workers in transition, and in particular the surge of new unemployed workers. And secondly, it's really important, I think, that local authorities and combined authorities are empowered to look into and potentially pilot forms of UBI. But at the risk of having no friends at all, I think it's important that we don't rule out conditional or targeted approach with UBI, for example, starting with vulnerable groups, such as the young or the new unemployed, or a conditional UBI in the way Daniel has described, or perhaps focusing on those who are living in poverty. I hope I haven't been too long, Nick. That's it for now.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Anna. Well, you raised a lot of really important questions there. I'll just start the conversation, if I may, before we go into the question of the pandemic and whether it's accelerated various trends, just to Daniel, one of the things that, going into the crisis, you could say about the UK in particular, and perhaps not about the US, was that we had a high employment rate. We had lots of flexible work, lots of gig economy work, more self-employed people, and we had a real issue with stagnant wages, flatlining productivity, but we had very high levels of employment. And of course, the lockdown and the crisis has increased unemployment, and we can expect that to be a real challenge in the coming months. But it's very hard to square the picture of automation and increased ICT with that labour market in the UK. It may well be that we were not paying people much, the income shares were down, particularly for working class people, but the levels of employment were high. And how do you respond to that challenge?
I think one of the mistakes that people have made in thinking about the impact of technology on the labour market is to focus on jobs alone, to treat the number of jobs as the sort of the variable, the central variable of interest for trying to understand the impact of technology on the labour market. And what I do in the book is try and explain why it is that for various reasons is a misleading guide to what might be happening in the labour market. Really, the story of automation, as I describe it, is a story of the decline in the demand for certain types of worker. Now, it may be that in the end, if demand falls far enough, that leads to a decline in the number of jobs. But there are many other things that can change in response to decline in the demand for labor. And we've mentioned some of them, you know, the pay of certain workers, the quality of the work, the security of the work. I think one of the really valuable developments in the conversation about the future of work and the impact of technology on work at the start or towards the end of last year and at the start of this year was a focus on not simply, you know, the quantity of work, but the quality of work. So the way to square it is by emphasizing the fact that focusing on the number of jobs alone is going to be a misleading guide to whether or not technology is having a harmful or helpful effect on different parts of the labor market. It's one thing to look at, but there are many other things as well.
Good. Okay, thanks, Daniel. And I suppose just, I mean, if we're thinking then about that wider picture on the labour market, picking up on what Anna was saying about the pandemic and the acceleration of these sort of trends towards greater insecurity, the exposure of certain kinds of workers to the pandemic and so on. One of the issues about resting as much on contribution as you do and on social solidarity is that the crisis has perhaps accentuated a sense that, you know, key workers, essential workers are really important, that how we think about the kinds of labor that are valuable has really changed in this crisis. But that when we think about the kind of political support for new forms of welfare state, new forms of social security, often those sorts of people, particularly if they're in the gig economy or they're self-employed, have not been mobilized through trade unions and other forms, the forms of industrial society that gave expression to the politics that underpinned the welfare state in the 20th century. And so I wonder how you get to these sort of wider forms of social solidarity in the context of that kind of labour market.
Is that a question to myself rather than to Anna?
Perhaps to both of you, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so and what I argue in the book is that the state shouldn't simply take a role as a sort of income sharing state, passively, you know, taking income from certain groups and sharing it with others. That, yeah, again, there's not going to be a sudden big bang when all of a sudden people wake up and find themselves without work. That isn't the story. I think what I worry about, again, is this is just the consequences of a gradual decline in the demand for certain types of labor and what that means. And what I say in the book is that, look, we shouldn't just simply think of the state as an income sharing state. We need it also to be a labor supporting state. J.K. Galbraith had this phrase, countervailing power, that if you have concentrations of power in the economy, you need countervailing power elsewhere to balance them. And it seems to me that for exactly the reasons that you say and the trends that you identify, the sort of power that certain groups of worker in the economy have has declined. And some of these workers do very, you know, socially valuable work. And my worry is that, again, you know, one of the consequences of a decline in the demand for certain types of labor might not be in the number of jobs there are to be done, but in the bargaining power that those workers have over the quality and the pay and the security of that work. So I think this, I think the state, it shouldn't just simply be a kind of passive income sharing state. It has a role in supporting workers too. It's not simply about the state, though. I also think there's an obligation on the unions themselves, other the sort of organizations of collective action, of organized labor. I wrote a book in 2015 called The Future of the Professions, looking at how technology impacts white collar workers, lawyers, doctors, teachers, accountants, architects, and so on. And the central thesis of that book was that the traditional professions, traditional lawyers and doctors and teachers are, that traditional model is creaking. The traditional way of providing access to legal insight, medical expertise, educational knowledge is creaking, and that technology in many ways offers a way to provide alternative access to that expertise. I think the same can be said of unions and those traditional institutions, that the way in which they operate is in a similar way, hasn't changed for a very long time, despite the existence of quite interesting technological alternatives. So I think there's a role as well. It's not simply about the state; it's also about these organisations as well, reforming and changing what they do too.
Sorry, I think I lost you momentarily there at the end, but never mind. Anna, can I? Yeah, it's my, I think probably my internet connection. Anna, let me turn it over to you just on these questions that we've just been discussing. You talked very eloquently about what's happened in the crisis, the different kinds of work and the inequalities that have been exposed in risk and so on. How do you get to the forms of social solidarity or the forms of state action that Daniel describes, of countervailing power, of thinking about how the state steps in, not just to redistribute income, but to think about the structures of power in an economy? Those sorts of questions obviously are important here too, aren't they?
Yes, I think they do. I don't see that they are necessarily an alternative to having a conversation about UBI, that they would enrich it and supplement it. It has to be, so something like building social solidarity would require multi sort of dimensional approaches, including the ones that Daniel has set out, looking at different roles for unions and the community. In the Future of Work Commission report that we just put out, we suggested developing and piloting something called a health work core, which would combine some kind of guarantee for young people, at least, with community work focused on really pressing local needs, something that has happened in some states in the US. So I think that these, whilst UBI is not a silver bullet, but it doesn't contradict these other means of building social solidarity either. I'm not sure. The only thing that Daniel said that I'm not sure I agree about is whether or not a universal aspect to the income really would necessarily undermine social solidarity. I don't know what you think about that, Nick.
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence that people care about contribution and reciprocity. There's a lot of evidence of that in welfare states. And I think there's a lot of evidence that from political economy, if you like, that how people mobilize for certain changes is related to lots of things beyond their particular position in the labor market. It may be their education, it may be their stage in the life cycle, it may be their relationship to unions and other factors. So the kind of, when we think about basic income versus other kinds of welfare state or other kinds of public policy, those sorts of questions need to be weighed up, and often a lot of the debate really just is about how much does the basic income cost, and how do you distribute it and so on. But I want just because I want to open up to some questions from the people watching. We've got quite a lot of them. I want just to sort of pick up on one point that you've both touched on in different ways, which is this question of sort of experimentation, of how governments can experiment. And Anna raised this about pilot schemes or proposals for basic income. They've come up, I think, in the questions too, about the enthusiasm for doing basic income pilots in Scotland. Some English cities very interested in taking forward basic income pilots. And a lot of the pressure appears to be coming from sort of sub-national levels rather than at the national level. It's coming from kind of grassroots or local authorities or others. And I just, I think it's worth sort of reflecting on that question a little bit too, that where do the kind of forms of experimentation that might lead to new kinds of public policy and new kinds of state action come from? And what are the sort of sources of those things? Or do we just have to wait for there to be a government elected on a program for a basic income, or for a particularly, particular minister to have it on their agenda? Is that something you've, I mean, Anna and Daniel, perhaps you could have a reflection on that point before we open it up to some other questions.
Well, I guess as mentioned that we did recommend that there's some thought was given to compacts. So I think that we're quite close to the point where local authorities or combined authorities could initiate a programme and say what they would like to do and go to central government with the proposal and see what the response was. I mean, that's I don't know, Daniel, if you can put some meat on that.
Well, I mean, I think other than just to comment on the need for experimentation and piloting, one of the interesting features about a universal basic income is that even supporters of a UBI often find themselves disagreeing about exactly what it is that they agree they're favouring. What do we? I've spoken a little about what we might mean by universal, what we might mean by conditional, but there's then issues around what we might mean by basic, and then there's issues about whether or not it necessarily needs to be an income at all. For some people, the fact that it's an income, cash is key to the idea of a universal basic income, but for others, it doesn't need to necessarily be an income. It could be certain types of services made available for free, or indeed access to certain types of capital, certain types of asset. And there just seems so many dimensions to the idea of a UBI that experimenting and piloting in a small way with lots of different iterations and versions seems to me to be a very important thing to do. And adopting, I'd be sort of slightly concerned if it was something that was going to be adopted widely according to a particular central government specification, rather than something that was instead tested, piloted, experimented with incrementally at a more local level.
So
let me just, sorry, Anna, yeah, go ahead.
I was just reading a note that had come in to me just about going into the small print, I suppose. So if, for example, I wanted to start a UBI pilot in Manchester, you'd probably need to think about reprofiling your spend of existing benefits. You'd have to think about use of the pile of revenue spend cash that you have to send it as a non-conditional transfer to residents, and reprofile existing resources in your revenue spend budget. But there wouldn't be anything that I can see that would stop you doing that now.
Yeah, I think I mean, this comes to the issue of universality and conditionality, I suppose, that for many people, the attractiveness of a universal basic income is precisely that it is universal and you get it without conditions attached. And that, when the crisis struck, for example, the DWP had to lift the sanctions regime. People couldn't attend interviews with their job coaches, their work coaches, because of the public health threat that would entail. And in a sense, we moved very quickly to a situation where some of the conditionality and sanctions we got used to in the welfare state and the universal credit and other forms of support, job seekers allowance and so on were lifted. And I suppose for those defenders of a basic income, the idea that you introduce some form of kind of participation requirements denudes a basic income of one of its primary functions, which is to guarantee to everybody the means of some kind of at least subsistence, or of an income which isn't dependent just on the whims of the state or a politician who wants to introduce new forms of, conditionality on receipt. And so if we're talking about conditionality, or we're talking about different schemes which are not universal or which have different elements, are we really talking about a basic income anymore?
And that sort of goes to my point about it's not always obvious what it is, which aspect of a UBI it is that people think is core to what a UBI is. I think the point you raise about these issues about conditionality raised in elections during this crisis is a really important one, because it's a good example of how we are in this crisis. The sense of social solidarity is overwhelming. It's unimaginable that anybody would complain about the universality of the support that's being offered at the moment. And that's why I've been, at the start of this crisis, I was very much in favor of a temporary universal basic income. In fact, it was its universality which made it so attractive. It was very simple. It could provide an immediate burst of financial support to all those who need it. But this is, the question is whether or not that universality would be acceptable in 12, 24, 36 months, once hopefully the pandemic passes and is less acute. And I worry that it wouldn't be, and that's the argument that I make in the book, that we need to find other ways, if not economic ones, of allowing people to make feel like they're making a contribution to society and be seen to be making a contribution. And I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. As we've noted, there are many types of work that people do that the labor market might have deemed not particularly valuable in the fact it receives a low wage, but yet socially we recognize as being incredibly valuable and incredibly useful. It's been very clear during this pandemic, but it was obvious before the pandemic as well. Key workers have been key for some time. We didn't need a pandemic to know that was the case. And so it strikes me that there's a real opportunity as a community to recognize certain types of work as being socially valuable and socially important, to hold it up and say, we see this as being a contribution to society, even if the market mechanism might have given it attached a lower wage to it.
But I suppose that takes us then into the territory of saying, well, shouldn't you try to guarantee a minimum income for people, even if that income can come from a variety of sources? The Spanish government is doing something similar to this at the moment. Not a basic income, but an income guarantee. And that might come from work. It might come from valuing other forms of non-paid employment where the state is then making available some extra income to you. And it might come from a sort of service guarantee as well. You might add to a minimum income guarantee some kind of sense of universal services, childcare, education, transport, and so on, which together constitute the kind of means of an individual life within a community, rather than resting everything on the idea of an income transfer, a basic income. And of course there are, I suppose, and this, I put this one to you as well, Anna, the many people who oppose a basic income but are nonetheless in favor of much more expansionary fiscal policy, people like modern monetary theorists and others, argue that you need a job guarantee. What the state should do is guarantee people a job rather than an income. And is that certainly when we get into the autumn, we'll be thinking about, well, how do young people get work? And perhaps we'll be thinking less about their immediate income needs as we were at the beginning of the crisis. What do you think about that, Anna? Did your commission look at that, the idea of a job guarantee, or has your institute looked at that?
Yes, I mean the relevant recommendation was something like some form of work guarantee in the context of the health work corps that we mentioned, which also I don't see as incompatible to the UBI, and ties up with some of the comments on the chat about how it's really important that UBI is part of a package, of support, and not regarded at all as a standalone measure. So I mean I do also think and so our chair Chris Peterades is very keen on the idea of universal basic services as well, so that's obviously focused around meeting people's needs rather than a cash universal cash transfer, and that sounds close, Nick, to what you're suggesting there. that also needs review. Our point, I think, is that UBI needs to be in that debate alongside the job guarantee and the UBS.
Yeah. So we've got some, just to look at some of the questions, we've got some questions which are a little bit more technical, if you like, which are about, well, how do you deal with things like housing costs in the universal basic income? We know that, if you live in London and the Southeast, you have typically higher rents and higher housing costs. At the moment, we meet those through housing allowance, housing benefit. A basic income would either have to be set at a very high level, so that those people who have higher housing costs could meet them, or you'd need to add something like a housing benefit, a housing subsidy to be able to deal with that problem. And people with disabilities who have extra needs, where they have either services that they need to buy, or they have income that they require in order to be able to achieve certain levels of capability and functioning, might also say, we need more than a basic income. Your basic income is not enough to enable us to participate as full and equal citizens. And as we start to get into those questions, the simplicity of one income starts to become more complicated, and we start to need to introduce additional elements in a welfare state. And in fact, we start to get closer to, if you like, some of the ways in which existing welfare states work. And I suppose you could say the same thing, I think, about some of what we've been talking about particular kinds of employee. We've seen in the crisis that certain forms of self-employed workers have been kind of left out of the government support schemes by virtue of their circumstances. And some people have said that's an argument for a basic income, but others might say, well, actually, the welfare state just needs to be more intelligent and less invasive and less conditional. But what we need to do is to take existing mechanisms and improve them, rather than to create whole new infrastructures that a basic income would entail. And I don't think either of you would disagree with a kind of an approach which was more incremental, which had different elements in it, which was open to different kinds of ways of approaching these questions. But for some of those questions that people at home are posing to us, it looks like the answer, once you start to try and address these questions of disability, housing costs, different forms of labour status and so on, require you to have something that unsurprisingly gets to look and feel like a welfare state, not dissimilar to those that we might see in places like continental Europe and even in the UK, which has got a relatively parsimonious one. What do you think about those sorts of things, Daniel, Anna?
I think that's right. I mean, and that's one of my concerns about a universal basic income. I suppose it's worth stepping back and just, what problem is a universal basic income trying to solve? I mean, for me, going back to this issue of automation, the challenge is, well, what do we do? Yeah, but for me, the challenge of technological unemployment is fundamentally a distributional challenge. It's how do we share our income in society when our traditional way of doing so, paying people in the labor market for the work that they do, is less effective than it might have been in the past. The response, it seems to me, is that, well, if the labor market is failing to fulfill that distributional role, we need another mechanism to do it. And it seems to me that the only way to do that is through the state. And to some extent, what we've seen during the pandemic has sort of confirmed that suspicion. The robots haven't taken all the jobs, but this virus has just completely decimated the demand that so many jobs rely upon. And the measures we've adopted have constrained the supply side as well and stopped people working too. So we find ourselves in a world with less work, not because of automation. And what we've seen are governments around the world stepping forward to take on that distributional role, to share out income without the labor market. What worries me and what sort of pushes me towards a basic income is that if you look at the design of many welfare states around the world, many social security systems, they're built upon the labor market. Or key features of it are built upon the labor market. You're either, you're in work and contributing to a system, you're in work that's poorly paid and your pay is topped up, you're out of work and the welfare system is designed to act like a sort of trampoline, retraining and getting you back into work. And if we take the threat of automation seriously, and we think that this structural technological unemployment could be, not just a small problem, but a big problem in the future, then I worry about, just continuing to tinker with a welfare state or social security system at the core of which is the labor market, might be a mistake, and that we might need something like a basic income, conditional or unconditional, that, is just separate from the labor market, that where the income that you get does not depend upon your labor market status, your ability to work, whether you're in work and so on, that it's a sort of just a different type of distribution mechanism. And that's why in the book, I end up thinking, in decades to come, if we face this structural problem, we might want something just very simple and completely different, a basic income, rather than tinkering and tailoring with our existing welfare system. That's why it is.
I mean, that's a very interesting point. I mean, in many ways, of course, you can say that the growth of the welfare state in the post-war period, in social democracies in particular, was designed precisely to decommodify people's citizenship, to say you don't rely on labor income or the market to satisfy your basic needs for housing, for education, for health services, even for things like childcare, and the state will come in to provide those collectively in a non-commodified form. And in the 1990s and 2000s, many parties, social democratic parties, started to worry that meant that people weren't being then helped sufficiently to gain an income when they were making a transition from industrial society in particular to the service economy, to what was then thought of as a knowledge economy. And therefore, to do more to socially invest in people, to get them able to take up work, to help them with their skills and education, to invest in their capabilities, because simply decommodifying them meant that they could be long-term unemployed, meant they could stay in poverty, meant they couldn't take advantage of knowledge economy jobs. They weren't able to make the transition to the higher levels of a service economy and so on. And I suppose, one of the questions there then is, how far do we want basic income to be about, or other forms of welfare state support to be about promoting people's skills, capabilities, their ability to earn a market income, or their ability to do other things than a market income, but nonetheless to invest in them, to have a kind of social investment approach? And how far do we think it's actually about going back to that notion of decommodifying human existence and providing a different form of citizenship that is not reliant on a labour market where, as you say, automation, technological change and others is making it harder for people to achieve their well-being through that kind of income? That's quite a big, that's quite a big choice, if you like, to make in thinking about these questions.
That's right. And what's interesting is that in your articulation of that original conception of the welfare state, it sounds an awful lot like a sort of universal basic services, that you get access to these various types of services or provision, independent of your status in the labor market. I mean, my answer to that big question for me depends upon whether or not we're taking this idea of a world with less work seriously. If we think we are approaching a world where there is just less well-paid work for people to do, and that the future of work, it's less and less a story about the future of work and more a story about the future of leisure and the future of how we spend our spare time, then I think a sort of return to that early conception is it seems to me to be more palatable, more appropriate. If though you think that that these fears about a world with less work are overblown, and that the labor market will remain the primary distribution mechanism in society, the main way we share our income in society, then I can see kind of resistance to that move.
What about Anna? Please go ahead.
Say that as far as the Overton window is concerned, I think very strongly that where the opening is at the moment, that we should tie, that the UBI debate needs to be tied to support for recent challenges and people in transition, including the new unemployed, rather than dissociating it from work and attaching it to a world without work. So in terms of framing, I would urge that framing. Looping back to a couple of earlier questions very quickly, Nick, before you move on. Firstly, I mean, it would need a new infrastructure, wouldn't it, to set up UBI and require registration. But equally, the furloughing scheme has shown how relatively easily that can done, and potentially it could be, I mean, not that particular scheme, that it could be converted, which is why it's so kind of ripe in a sense for piloting. And the other question that I didn't get a chance to answer about allowances is that I think it's clear that for some people with additional vulnerabilities, and disability is the easiest way of thinking about the problem, you would have to supplement the UBI, but I don't think that necessarily undermines the argument. You just add on an allowance according to these sort of additional needs. Back to you.
One of the sort of set of questions that has come up in the chat relates to the question of how you pay for a basic income. And one answer to that, I know Jeff Crocker is on this chat. Jeff argues that if we have sovereign money, if the state takes sovereign responsibility for money issuance, that we can afford a UBI. The questions that arise are much more about things like inflation and and so on, and that dovetails a little bit with a lot of what's been debated and discussed in the context of the response to this crisis by central banks. You've seen enormous interventions in the global economy by the Fed, by the Bank of England, underpinning the liquidity in the markets, but also, of course, major extensions of quantitative easing and so on. And so one argument is that, actually we don't need to worry so much about this question of where does the money come from. We issue the basic income and people work and people pay taxes and we decide how we divide up the cake. That's kind of one argument here, that the crisis has also thrown up these kinds of challenges to orthodox ways of thinking about fiscal and monetary policy. And related to that, I suppose, is, if you are sort of thinking about after the initial shock of the pandemic, the next decade or so, there will be choices to be made about how the public finances, the debt and so on, initially the deficit, then later the debt, are dealt with. And if we want to do a basic income, and you don't take that more heterodox view, nonetheless, you have to start thinking about things like wealth taxes or ways in which we can improve our social security in the broadest sense without asking the broad mass of the population to pay for it, and at worst, go back to a form of austerity that took money out of working age welfare, that cut benefits and cut social security. So I suppose, just one issue for us perhaps to debate a little bit there, Daniel and Anna, is the kind of who pays question. Can we sidestep that question? Can we take a more heterodox view of it? Or if we do take a more orthodox one, where do we go for the resources that the society might want to improve social security, given that we've come out of a period in the UK and elsewhere of extensive austerity?
And I think Anna, do you mind if I jump in? Is that okay? Yeah. I think we've got to ask that question, how do we pay for it, in the context of what's happened in the last 3 months. The debate over the last 10 years here and in Europe has essentially been, how austere should we be? And that's the context in which conversations about how do we pay for a UBI have taken place. And it's just I find it very interesting how debates about how austere we should be seem now in this moment just to apply to a sort of parallel economic universe we no longer inhabit. Debates about austerity just don't sort of capture or just don't seem to apply to the moment that we're in. And I say this because I think there's a question that people will ask in months to come, which is, well, why is it that our pre-existing economic crises, crises of poverty, of homelessness, of worklessness, and so on, didn't necessitate the same sort of suspension in reasoning about fiscal austerity that we've seen in response to this crisis. Now, clearly, this crisis is very different in lots of ways, but the response to it has just been so dramatically different to the response to other types of economic crises that we faced over the last 10 years, other types of suffering and hardship as well. And so I think now we need to have, and I think people will have, this conversation about the role of the state and a universal basic income in this new. We need to start asking this question again in this new context, without the sorts of without the sort of constraint of austerity on our immediate mind. I'm conscious that as you look further out, the debate about austerity does start to bite again. But in the moment that we're in, it doesn't seem to me to be the most important question to be asking.
I think I can add a little bit, if that's all right. This is reminding me of a piece that our chair, Chris Pisarades, contributed to in the New Statesman, called sort of Top Economists Warn Against Austerity, in which he made the point that the debt that we're accruing doesn't need to be repaid, or not yet. And that it would be a false economy to do so. I will leave you to read the small print if you wish to do that. The second point is that, in a sense, sort of thinking about some form of UBI, of course, depending on the form that took, would be, you could think of it as a similar cost to furloughing, which we're already in that territory now. And the third point, Nick, in response to your point about wealth tax, it's great that today that there has been a review of the capital gains tax announced by the Chancellor, which our view is a good place to start, given it's not distortionary, but shouldn't exclude other forms of effective wealth tax.
I think exactly. Just in response to that final point from Anna, I think that this conversation about sharing out income, there's also got to be a parallel conversation. If you're spending more, the other side of the equation is that you have to also tax more. And I can't imagine, you can see the sort of hesitation at the moment to talk about increasing tax from both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, but I can just see that becoming more and more of an issue as time goes on. And clearly, in thinking about something like a universal basic income, it also has to come with a conversation about tax reform, how to tax the other types of capital that are becoming increasingly valuable in society if some people's human capital is becoming less and less valuable. Yeah.
Well, that raises an important point, because of course one of the other debates we've been having recently is whether too many people are going to university. The Education Minister arguing that graduates were not able to obtain graduate level employment and earnings, that people were underemployed in the graduate labour market. And he turned that into a familiar argument, we need more vocational apprenticeships and we need to be more German and have technical education and all the rest of it. But in that insight, coming back to some of the points you started with, Daniel and Anna, is the idea that, that if education and human capital isn't buying the kinds of returns that it used to, that if it isn't guaranteeing higher levels of income, graduate incomes in particular, and you're still asking people to pay tuition fees and all the rest of it, that that system will start to kind of break down, and that actually a basic income might be thought of as a way of enabling particularly young people to make a transition into adult life, choosing between different kinds of education and work, choosing different levels of education, but might also be something we need to think about, precisely because we can't rely on investment in education to give us the kinds of incomes that we thought we used to be able to expect. And to relate that to the automation debate, that if you're not going to need as many lawyers, and if lots of forms of work are going to be automated. And I just wonder whether, given that for so long, we've had a public discourse that education is the key to social mobility, education is the key to higher earnings, education is the key to economic success. Is that starting to break down, and is basic income a kind of at least an answer to that? or part of the answer? Do you want to jump in, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, this is a worry that I have in the book, and I have a chapter called "The Limits to Education," precisely responding to this, or engaging with this issue, because the story of the 20th century has been a story, the traditional story that's told of technological change is that it's been skill biased, that it's tended to increase the returns to, and you can see this in lots of countries around the world, that it's increased the return to skills. And so the policy response is, well, we ought to encourage more and more people to get more education. And what more means there is change as the 20th century goes on, but it's the race between education and technology, that the response to technological change is more education of some sort. And my view is that perhaps that's a response to that frictional problem where people don't have the right skills to do the work that's available. But we might worry, for the reasons that you're saying, that it might be an imperfect response to that. That it might be that even if people do have certain skills, that those aren't, the demand for those skills isn't what it used to be. But my other concerns is just, more education doesn't address this issue of place mismatch. It doesn't address this issue of identity mismatch, and it doesn't really engage with this structural problem, which is, well, what do we do if there's, if one of the consequences of technological change is that it doesn't simply complement certain types of workers, but it substitutes for more and more, not workers, but tasks and activities. It substitutes for human beings in more and more tasks and activities. And education doesn't seem to me to engage with that structural issue. So, in a sense, education and a universal basic income are responding to different types of problem in the labor market. And that's why I worry in the book that I think there are limits to education, and that it is a policy response that can't adequately deal with the changes that are taking place in the world of work.
I mean, thanks very much, Daniel. I mean, and I'll just come to you in a second, but just to be clear, because in some of the comments on this issue, it's not an argument that education should just be about equipping people for work, that you reduce education to a utilitarian function.
No.
Rather is that if education isn't generating the same kind of returns, and if that kind of knowledge economy is not functioning in the way that people thought it was, that it opens up a fuller account of what education can be, more lifelong learning, more creativity, more ability to learn and study across a range of things. But you need something like a basic income or some other social security to enable that to happen. And so it's not, the argument here is precisely to try to uncouple education from being offered as an answer to labour market questions. Anyway, Anna, sorry, do you want to come in on this point at all about the sort of future of skills and education and their relationship to some of the questions we've been discussing about work and basic income?
Oh, mostly, Nick, just to agree, and perhaps to make the point that UBI wouldn't replace education and shouldn't be seen again as opposed to it, but might even enable people to pick it up. So a sort of rather basic point there. But also, education is, of course, hugely important in many ways, but it isn't an answer to all of the challenges that we and Daniel has identified this evening. So perhaps, so in the same way that meritocracy is no longer a kind of answer, education in itself is perhaps no longer an answer.
Great, okay, thanks very much. So I'm just going to quickly have a look and see whether I can find any more questions that we haven't dealt with here. I mean, we've just been talking about education, and we've been talking about different ways of thinking about contribution. There are some I think a lot of people agreeing that lifelong learning is really important. One is there are quite a lot of people raising this question of kind of what forms of work do we need, though, for a kind of dealing with climate change, for green recovery. That's a very big question. I don't want to kind of open up all that, because I know that some of the other campus conversations will deal with these sorts of questions. But are there ways in which, you know, the debate about basic income can connect to thinking about some of the other big societal transformation we need to make in terms of thinking about energy transitions, moving away from a fossil fuel economy, trying to connect how we think about our income and how we maintain our social security and living standards with these wider questions of living in a net zero economy? Perhaps that's for another day, but as that's been raised a lot in the chat, I thought I would put it to you both, Daniel and Anna.
I mean, my reaction to that is that it just seems like a very interesting possibility. So, yeah, in thinking about what sort of conditions might be attached to a basic income, what sort of work might we recognize as being socially valuable and socially important and representing a contribution? Well, that's precisely the sort of work that you know, a particular community or a particular society might have in mind, that engaging with those sorts of activities is the sort of thing that ought to be recognized as being valuable and important.
Great. Anna, do you want to say anything? We're coming to the end of the time now, and I want you to say a little bit at the end. I just wonder if you had anything you wanted to add at all.
No, just to agree with that, and welcome this initiative. You know, putting UBI in the mainstream. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you to you both. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Anna. Thanks very much indeed for sharing your insights and expertise with us. I think the basic income conversation folk will want to try to share some links with participants to your work, to your Institute's work, Anna, to Daniel's books and to his research. So that'd be really good for people to be able to explore more about what you've argued tonight in your publications, your research publications. I want to say also, just in wrapping this up, I mean, a big thank you all for engaging tonight, for sending in your thoughts, your questions, for watching and listening. This is the first of a series of debates that the basic income conversation is doing over the summer, as I mentioned at the start. The next one is on Monday, the 27th of July at 6:30 p.m. again, and it will be on basic income pilots. So of course we've had a pilot of, it's not really a basic income, but it's something, unconditional support in Finland. We've had a lot of activity in Scotland where local authorities, SNP, others trying to develop some pilots. And the director of the basic income conversation, Michael Pugh, will be joined for that session by Paul Vaughan from Fife Council, who was a key member of the Scottish feasibility study that came out last month. And they'll be joined by Professor Ollie Kangas. Ollie, who was at my institute last year as a visiting fellow, is from the University of Turku in Finland, and his organization has been responsible for the evaluation or setting up of the pilots in Finland and their evaluation, which has now been taken forward quite extensively. So there'll be a lot to learn from Ollie. Ollie's are really good at telling people what happened in Finland and why. And then the third and final one is on Monday, the 10th of August, which is paying for basic income. And that picks up on some of the questions I raised briefly tonight, monetary financing and sovereign money. And that'll be with the economist and writer Francis Coppola, with Jeff Crocker and Emma Dorney also speaking. So links to those will be circulated. Click on those, open them up in your browser, sign yourselves up before the call ends. Just again to say thank you very much to everybody for attending. Thanks to Daniel, thanks to Anna. Let's keep the conversation going. These are really important issues, lots to be discussed. Whatever your view on basic income, these are profoundly important questions for our society. So thanks very much indeed for taking part this evening. Thanks a lot.